Well, we can speak now to Pascal Lamy, who is the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, and he joins us now from Paris. Mr. Lamy, you led the World Trade Organization from 2005 to 2013. You were also a former EU Trade Commissioner. And I'd like to start by asking you, President Trump has threatened extra tariffs on some EU nations for not agreeing to his plans on Greenland. First question to you, is that workable? And can you impose tariffs on individual nations, or do you have to impose tariffs on all 27 members of the EU bloc?
No, legally speaking, he can impose tariffs on EU nations individually, legally speaking. The problem being that the implementation of that implies that you define the national origin of this export, because if it's Germany and not Italy, the origin is that what you export has to be produced in Germany or in Italy. And this is a bureaucratic headache because the EU is a custom union. So for many years, we haven't had anything like a national or origin. We've had an EU origin. These things are produced within the EU with a very tight span of supply chain. So it's very difficult to identify part of what the European exports. If it's French champagne, okay, we know where champagne is produced. It's in France and in some regions of France. But if it's a car, it's very difficult to define whether this car is German or Italian or Hungarian. So, yes, in theory, in practice, it's a bureaucratic nightmare.
Okay. Now, I want to quote you on something you said in the past, and you said this with regards to negotiating with the United States on matters of trade and China, and you said it should be done with a gun in your pocket. And I wondered what you meant by that.
Well, what I mean by that is that, especially with Trump, but we've always had, trade frictions with the US or with China for the last decade, and a fortiori even more with Mr. Trump, he negotiates with a gun on the table. He says, I want you to do that, and if you don't do that, that's tariffs. What I mean by what I said is that we may not need to have the gun on the table, but we need to have it in our pocket, and he needs to know it. Mr. Trump sometimes steps back. This has happened quite a number of times since he proclaimed the new structure of so-called reciprocal tariffs in last April. In a number of areas or circumstances, he stepped back. So the issue for us now is we have to deploy enough of a counter threat so that he steps back. Now, we did not do that in this famous Thornbury deal, where we accepted an asymmetric 15% on his side, 0 on our side. And the reason why we didn't do that at the time was that we needed the US in Ukraine, and we didn't want to antagonize them. For the Europeans, losing Ukraine is more important than losing 2 or 3% of US market share. That's the previous episode. We now are in a new episode where the issue is Greenland, and our level of deterrence and of escalation and of counter threat has, in my view, to be much higher than in the previous episode, because the stakes for the European Union are higher this time.
Okay, so let's talk about what that counter threat might look like and how the EU might start to look like a more formidable partner for trade discussions with the United States. And I think you might be of the view, do correct me if I'm wrong, that a coalition, a coordinated response is the way to go. And in that coalition, I think you've said in the past that the likes of China, India, Japan, South Korea, other countries, as well as the EU, who together make up about 80% of America's trade partners, should get together and find some sort of a common position. Do you still believe that's the right way to go? And why don't you think the EU has opted for that until this point?
Well, first, the EU has to act as one. EU is trade-wise a federation, so EU needs to show a united, strong countermeasure arsenal, hopefully not to use it, but to deter Trump's pressure. This is one, and it matters because in his mind, Trump believes the EU is a bunch of cowards. Like rabbits that will run at the first occasion. That's the way he sees Europe, and if we behave opposite to that, which we have the means to do it, this will create some sort of shock for him. Second, on this issue of the rest of the world, I remain of the view that that would be the best way to stop, moderate, contain this destruction which Trump is operating in the world economy and to some extent in the world trading system, although it hasn't happened so far, because so far each and every of us, EU, China, India, Australia and others, have believed that we'd better deal bilaterally. Now, as you may have noticed, this notion of a coalition to moderate Mr. Trump was the main message which Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, excuse me, delivered in Davos yesterday. So it's not my idea now, it's the idea of the Prime Minister of Canada, who has a variety of reasons to go in this direction. Excuse me.
Okay, so the coalition of these US trade partners could, you think, become a reality? But that's going to take a bit of time. So more immediately, as a tool that the EU has at its disposal, is the so-called anti-coercion instrument. It's never been used before. I wonder if you could tell me what impact the use of that tool would have.
Good question. So, level one of retaliation are counter tariffs, according to WTO rules, and there is a 90 billion tariff package which is ready, which was crafted at the time of the Thornberry discussion. That's level one. So we hit US exports in Europe, orange juice, bourbon, and Harley-Davidson. What you mentioned is a second level, which in our jargon is called the anti-coercion agreement, which offers a much wider range of possible measures, including trade measures, but also, for instance, measures that would hit the export of services from US into the European Union. And as we know, although Mr. Trump seems not to know that, the trade balance between the US and Europe is very much in favor of the US. So we have a capacity to hit US export, notably, for instance, in consulting or in finance, in many areas. And then we also have a series of other measures that go deeper and wider in imposing damage on the US economy, like, for instance, treasury bonds, and we have a few trillions of treasury bonds in the hands of EU operators, or even going the way Mr. Trump is going for Africa, for instance, which is refusing to give visas to people who want to go to the US. We could do the same. This is what he did with a few European people on the basis that they had campaigned against what he doesn't like in EU regulation on digital companies. So there is a whole range of unused tools so far, which could be mobilized, and which, by the way, the US regularly use against other countries.
Okay. I mean, just looking at what's been happening at Davos and listening to what your successor, the World Trade Organization Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, listening to what she says, I think what we're seeing and hearing in Davos is a little bit of dialing down. And on that note, President Trump has said that he will not use force to take Greenland. So that seems to be off the table for now. I mean, do you agree with what she says, that there is now a dialing down? She's also said we need to find ways to ensure this doesn't result in a trade war. And I want to ask you who you think stands to lose the most if there is a trade war.
Well, first, de-escalating, dialing down. If Mr. Trump changes his mind and now says that the military option is off the table, which he did not say before, he said the contrary before, good news, he's stepping back. So there is, as Ngozi, and let me call her by her first name because she's a good friend of mine, what she says is right. If there is a de-escalation, if there is a dialing down, good news, let's cool a bit the temperature, which means that we seem to be left with either you sell or I put tariffs on you. Again, this is a matter of a discussion which, in my view, and in the view of, let's say, normal people, should lead to reinforcing the defense of Greenland as part of NATO. If then we have to go to the confrontation on tariffs against tariff, then we are back to a situation where both will lose. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that opening trade is a win-win game, which I think it is, although I do recognize that the distribution of the gains is a big problem for some countries and some populations. Overall, if I do something better than you do, and you do something better than I do, we all win. So, trade opening is win-win, trade closing is lose-lose. The problem being, how much of this loss, of this damage, are you ready to impose on yourself? And this is a political matter.
Okay.
If things do not matter that much, then you can compromise at a level which is lower than what you should otherwise have accepted. If this is a matter of fundamental importance, then the trade-off changes, and this is where we are with Greenland.
Okay. And just lastly, I'd like to ask you about the fact that, US trade only accounts for about, well, let's say global imports. US global imports account for, I think it's 13% of all global imports. Right. So do you think, given that, okay, that implies there are lots of other importing nations in the world, do you think we're likely to see, and this is my last question to you, a sort of general shift away, a quiet one perhaps, by countries that decide they're going to shift their focus away from the United States to mitigate potential losses in situations like the one we find ourselves in today. Do you think that's likely to be the general direction some countries, and in particular the EU, decide to go in?
Yes, indeed. And this is, by the way, already happening. If you look at this EU trade deal with Mercosur, which is the largest EU ever signed, and we still have to make sure it's ratified by the European Parliament. If you look at the EU-India trade discussions, if you look at discussions with Indonesia, and I'm only speaking with the EU, yes, if you lose market in the US, the normal reaction will be to try and gain market elsewhere. And this triggers a range of possibilities of agreements which were not there before because you were making good business in the US. If you stop making good business in some areas, you try to do good business elsewhere. And you're absolutely right. US is only 13% of world imports. And if other countries keep their head cool and do not follow suit, this will be a problem for the US, as it has been. I mean, inflation in the US was 0.5% more than with a tariff than without tariffs. But this does not mean that global market capitalism will not adjust. And in my view, the world trading system can adjust to a sort of 10% tariff fence around the US, which is probably what it is trade-weighted, as it does for an evolution of the price of oil or the price of the Chinese minimum wage. I mean, it's a bit like water. If it can't go somewhere, it probably will go elsewhere. So yes, this will trigger new trade deals by countries who believe what they lose on the US market, both imports and exports, they will find elsewhere.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave the conversation there, but we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us and sharing that with us. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
My pleasure. My pleasure.